Students, we are going to be starting the first of 3 chapters that cover the nervous system. So chapter 10 is the basic structure and function of the nervous system. Chapter 11 discusses the breakdown and the classification of the different parts. And then chapter 12 is about special and general senses. So we'll start off with chapter 1, and the first thing we'll be talking about is, what are the parts of the nervous system? So the nervous system, generally speaking, detects any changes in the surrounding. Those changes can either be changes in the outside world, like temperature, pain, touch, and so on, or these changes could be in the inside, internal environment, like changes in oxygen levels, carbon dioxide, pH levels, and so on. It'll also compare these changes to the thermostats that are found inside the body. It'll make decisions. It'll stimulate different muscles or glands depending on the response to these changes. And in doing so, it'll maintain homeostasis that we've discussed during chapter 1 or 2. The neural tissue is made out of 2 different kinds of cells. The main cell is the neuron. Neuron is equal to nerve cell. The neuron is the actual main player of the nervous system. These neuroglial cells are the support system of neurons. So neurons react to changes. Okay, they detect these changes. They detect the stimuli. They integrate them, so they collect a lot of data. They interpret that data and they act upon that. Okay, so they react to changes. They send nerve impulses in order to communicate. The neuroglia, on the other hand, like I said, these are the support system. Okay, so these help in the nourishment of neurons. They help in maintaining what is known as the blood-brain barrier, which is a barrier between the nervous tissue and the blood in the capillaries. And we'll see that what kind of cells, neuroglial cells, do we have in the brain and spinal cord, as opposed to the neuroglial cells that we have in the peripheral nerves. So we divide the nervous system anatomically into a central nervous system, and that would be brain and spinal cord, and then a peripheral nervous system, and those are the cranial nerves and spinal nerves. So you can see them here in this image. Again, your CNS is the brain and spinal cord, while the peripheral nervous system would be the nerves coming out of the CNS. So the nerves coming out of the brain are known as cranial nerves, and the nerves coming out of the spine are known as spinal nerves. Okay, so again, your CNS, brain, and spinal cord, while your peripheral would be your cranial and spinal nerves. If we categorize the peripheral nervous system according to function, so remember that was your anatomical or structural classification. But when we classify the peripheral nervous system according to their function, we have a sensory or afferent division. Sensory division takes or picks up any sensory information. It could be vision, hearing, touch, pain, pressure. All of these are sensory stimuli. It will detect those stimuli through these receptors and then send that information to or towards the CNS on the sensory neuron, or the which, all of them would make your sensory division. While the motor division, okay, these send orders from the CNS to the effectors. Those effectors could either be a skeletal muscle, so things that we can voluntarily control, and we call that part of the motor division, we call it the somatic nervous system. Or if the effector are things that we have no conscious control over, like smooth muscles, cardiac muscles, or glands, that would be under the control of the autonomic nervous system. So a little bit about migraines. Migraines are more common than we think, okay? And the signs of a migraine would be a pounding headache. So if you've experienced a migraine, you know the difference between a regular headache and a migraine. So these migraines, they're pounding. The pain is pounding. Sometimes it is associated with some nausea, even vomiting in severe cases. There is an aura sometimes where there's like these images that are seen on the peripheries in the visual field. Sometimes there is light or sound sensitivity where during the migraine attack, the patient would need to be in a darker room with minimal light and minimal sound. There are some environmental triggers. Okay, so sometimes being exposed to bright light or certain foods like chocolate, lack of sleep, stress, being in high altitudes, stormy weathers, or too much caffeine or too much alcohol. Sometimes these are triggers for migraines. There are hormonal triggers, and those are more common in women, where migraines tend to occur prior to menstruation. Migraines generally can last anywhere between 4 hours to about 72 hours. So 72 hours, that is, 3 days? And what is happening in the neurons, although we're really not exactly sure what it is, but most of the cases, there is a period of hyperexcitation of the nerves followed by unresponsiveness of these nerves. And that would lead to stimulation of these very painful senses that we feel. Okay, so a good approach to prevent a migraine is that if you know what triggers the migraine, try to avoid these triggers, and that tends to reduce the frequency of attacks. Now, how do we treat migraines? Well, there are certain drugs known as triptans. Okay, those lead to the constriction of the blood vessels supplying these neurons, but it does have a disadvantage or a side effect that could pose some risk to some patients. So leading to the vasoconstriction can lead to, hypertension and other risk factors. So that's something that you want to keep in mind. Or we could do what is known as transcranial magnetic stimulation. That is sometimes done in severe, acute, or chronic migraines. Excuse me. Botox injections have been used in the treatment of migraine to relax the muscles in the head and neck area. And we also use concomitation with a drug that decreases the inflammation of the blood vessels that are associated with migraines. Some drugs have actually been used to treat other conditions, and now were found to also help in the treatment of migraine. So we call these repurposed drugs. Okay, for example, antidepressants, anticonvulsants, some drugs that we used to treat high blood pressure. Some of them by coincidence we found out, or by accident we found out that they also help in the decreasing or reducing the frequency of a migraine. So we kind of repurposed those and use them as migraine treatments. Now, moving on to the general function of the nervous system, the nervous system has three main functions. There is a sensory function, and this function lets us receive sensory information. So as we were saying, that the sensory function receives information from the receptors. It takes that info towards the central nervous system. So the information is carried to the CNS. Any info carried to the CNS is sensory information, or sensory. These neurons would have a sensory function. And I'm going to kind of skip down to the motor function. And these motor functions are literally orders. Okay, so these are the decisions that are going to go to the effectors. And remember, the effectors could either be a skeletal muscle, and those neurons would be part of the somatic nervous system, or those could be involuntary instructions. Okay, those would be going to your smooth muscles, cardiac muscles, or glands, and those would be carried over through the autonomic nervous system. Okay, so any impulses carried from the CNS to the effectors would be carried on motor neurons. Now, connecting your sensory to motor neurons are these integrative neurons, or so this would be, they would perform the integrative function of the nervous system, where there has to be this communication between, the sensory stimuli that I'm getting from the outside world and what I am going to do about them. So integrative neurons connect the sensory and motor together. Okay, so the nervous system coordinates sensory information to create these different senses that we feel, memories and thoughts. The nervous system makes decisions, on body's responses to your sensory information. So again, integrative is literally telling you that it integrates sensory and motor together. So let's take a look at what the nervous system, the neuron, looks like. Okay, they are very different in their size and shape. Some are longer than others. Some are have more dendrites than others. And if you're not familiar with what a dendrite is, we will in a minute. But they generally have these, share these features. There is a cell body, and that's the soma that contains the nucleus. It has the cytoplasm with all of the organelles and neurofilaments, and it has a chromatophilic substance. The rough ER of the neurons can be stained with and when you look at under an electron microscope, it gives out this greenish color, hence the name chromatophilic, because it likes color. And they were discovered by a scientist with the last name of Nissl, so he named them after himself. So these Nissl bodies or the chromatophilic substances, are just fancier words for the rough endoplasmic reticulum of the neuron. Now, dendrites, these are the branches that receive information. Okay, these are your receiving ends, and it would take whatever info to the cell body. Cell bodies can have more than one dendrite. They usually do, actually. They're usually branched out. And then the axon transmits the impulse or the electricity, also known as the action potential, away from the cell body until it reaches the end of the axon, and that's where the neurotransmitters would be. Okay, the end of the axon would transmit the action potential or the orders to either another neuron or to one of the effectors. And neurons have one axon. So a neuron has one cell body, one axon, but can have multiple dendrites. So we'll take a look at this picture right here. Okay, so this right here is the cell body. You can see here the nucleus. You can see the Nissl bodies. Okay, and you can see the cytoplasm, obviously. You can see all of these little branches here. These are the dendrites. These are your receiving ends again. So any action potential will go from into the cell body through the dendrites. And then there is one axon, and you can see the action potential going away. The direction would be away from the cell body. This little funnel shape at the very beginning of the axon is known as the axon hillock. And when we talk about how the action potential is generated in the neuron, we will definitely be mentioning the axon hillock. You can also see at the very end of the axon, there are these little parts, and those are known as the synaptic knobs, those are found at the axon terminals. So at the end of the axon, we have synaptic knobs, and these synaptic knobs have vesicles. These vesicles are full of the neurotransmitters, so they could be full of maybe different chemicals like acetylcholine, serotonin, norepinephrine, whatever, depending on where you are in the body. And we will be discussing some of these neurotransmitters at the end of this chapter. On this nerve, you can see a myelin sheath. Okay, myelin, made out of these Schwann cells wrapped around the axon and leaving these little gaps in the middle. Those gaps are known as the node of Ranvier. And that helps myelination makes transmission of the action potential faster. More on that right here. So your myelination of axons in the peripheral nervous system would be by the action of Schwann cells. So Schwann cells are basically a cell made out of fat. You want to think of your axons as wires, and they definitely are. They transmit electricity, so you want to insulate them from the rest of the body, just like you would do electrical wires. You have an insulator. These Schwann cells have the ability, they're made out of fat, okay? So they would insulate the axon from the surrounding tissue. The cell, as you can see here, has that little one nucleus, and then it would wrap itself around the axon. That wrapping is known as a myelin sheath. Okay, and again, your node of Ranvier are the gaps in between the in between those Schwann cells. So what about myelination of an axon? Axons can either be myelinated or not. The majority of our axons are myelinated, but we do definitely have unmyelinated axons. Know that whether myelinated or not, they are always going to be surrounded by a Schwann cell. So what is the difference then? Well, the difference is that if you look here, okay, this is right here, that's a Schwann cell. You can see that purple nucleus. Oops. You can see the nerves, the axons kind of like embedded in there, but the cell does not wrap around the axon. So these are unmyelinated axons. So yes, they are surrounded by a little bit of fat made by, coming from that cytoplasm, but there's no wrapping. Okay, so again, and those electrical wires have to be insulated. Either they are very well insulated, like in these myelinated axons, or not very well insulated, like these unmyelinated axons. So in both cases, there are Schwann cells involved. But again, in unmyelinated axons, the Schwann cell does not wrap itself around the axon. This right here shows you myelinated axons, where that again is the one cell, that is the axon, and you can see here how the cytoplasm or the cell wraps itself around the axon, giving you that very thick myelin sheath. This is what it looks like under an electron microscope, where this is an unmyelinated axon, so very thin layer, just the cytoplasm, while here you can see this is definitely a myelinated axon with layers and layers of that Schwann cell wrapped around. So what is multiple sclerosis? So remember we said that the myelin sheath assists in the propagation of the action potential. It helps electricity go through that nerve. Multiple sclerosis is an autoimmune disease where the immune system makes antibodies against its own myelin sheath. That would lead to the destruction of the myelin sheath, and then upon healing of that destruction, it will lead to scarring, hence the name sclerosis. And because it happens over and over again, so usually these individuals, the patients get these like attacks where their condition gets worse, and then remissions. So they go through these exacerbations and remissions, and hence the name multiple sclerosis. That would lead to it to the effect, it'll affect their motor abilities. Okay, so these muscles can become atrophic, and they would stop contracting. Other symptoms include blurred vision. It tends to happen to the optic nerves, which are the nerves carrying vision from the eye. They could have mood problems, muscle weakness, numbness if it's affecting sensory nerves, and so on. Treatment, just like any autoimmune disease, would definitely be to suppress the immune system. Now, at this point, I'm going to stop this first portion, and I will see you in part 2.